Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, sir.
How are you today?
Oh, pretty good. I'm keeping warm. I got my toasty fire going in the background here, and the snow is starting to melt. We got probably 1.5 feet.
That's the thing about New Mexico. It snows like crazy for a couple of days, but then the sun comes out, and it's always nice to have the sun come back out here.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
pretty dramatic this morning. I've got one of those cornices sliding off the roof that you have to walk under to get to the office here. So
Uh-huh.
it may be gone by the time I leave today.
Yeah.
We'll see. But I always enjoy the weather.
Yeah. So so a lot of our conversations over the years have started with what are you reading? What are you thinking about? And I want to be a little more specific in this one. In some of our past conversations, you've referred to Finnegan's Wake, and I think you've been wanting to talk about that for a while as like it sounded like a game changer for you. And I haven't read it. I've attempted some James Joyce a couple of times, and
Uh-huh.
I need to take another crack at it at some point. But I'm really curious to hear why Finnegan's Wake was such a needle mover for you, and kind of what
Yeah.
captivates you about it.
Well, since we're on the topics of books, we talked about Angle of Repose by Stegner as a preface here. I just finished that this morning. Very interesting ending to it, and what a maestro.
Okay.
It's self-reflective. It's definitely he's the father of the Western novel, and some refer to him, and a classic. And and Joyce, I think some people have considered the father of the modern novel, maybe.
Huh.
Joyce was a very interesting character happening in a very interesting time. And I think I've read Dubliners, Portraits of the Artist as a Young Man. I had not yet at least given a serious reading to Ulysses, and that's actually still on my list. But Finnegan's Wake is actually paired with Ulysses. And Finnegan's Wake, I think Joyce said about it, this is going to keep the professors scratching their head for 300 years. And maybe AI can help us with this and shorten some of that, but without some kind of an extra tool. Okay, so I've read a lot of books. Obviously, I went to school and it was like you'd have 300 pages to read in a week of not light reading. And so, you get a lot of associations, you get a lot of dexterity in just translating the written word into your brain. So, given that as a foundation, I tried to read Finnegan's Wake probably 5 or 6 times, and I just put it down. And then, and here I'm going to give away a big secret if you ever want to read Finnegan's Wake, I got the skeleton key to Finnegan's Wake, written by the incomparable and ever just what a treasure, Joseph Campbell, and another guy by the name of, I think it's Robertson. Or Robertson, something like that. And it's called the skeleton key because he doesn't give you at all. It's not like an abridged version where everything's explained. It's a skeleton key. There's not meat on the bones. You still have to wrestle with all the meat. The other resource was there are some famous people that turn out to be Joycean scholars like Marshall McLuhan, uh,
Really?
of course, Joseph Campbell.
I'm
Uh,
surprised about McLuhan for some reason. I just think of him as, yeah, just not a literary guy, but more like I don't know what I think of, what category I tend to put him in, but kind of like a futurist or something.
well, he's in a class of his own, it's sure, it's for true. But I think that Finnegan's Wake, uh, it's the last thing that Joyce wrote, and it pushes the medium of the written word into places that it has never been before. And it does it profoundly, and it does it in a way that it's like it has gotta be the largest greased pig of literary history.
Okay.
As far we talked about palming basketballs. Well, the basketball image doesn't do it justice. I think we gotta move to a whole greased pig
Grease
analogy for
pig.
this.
Okay.
I mean,
So I guess I associate that with it's hard to derive the intended meaning from it. It's hard to get a hold of. Is that what you mean?
oh boy, I wish I had the first 5 lines here to read to you, but it's okay, Joyce. There's just so many wonderful, wonderful things about this. Okay, well, let me try to start from the beginning to give you a grasp of this. Okay, so it's called Finnegan's Wake, and the story of Finnegan is not original to Joyce. It's an old Irish thing. Okay, so the story of Finnegan is a hod carrier, which is the dude that carries the mixed mud and the bricks up the ladder using an old fashioned device called a hod, which was like a board nailed to another board. So there's an angle in it on a stick so you can carry it, so you can slop mud or you can stack bricks. But you've got to carry it up these ladders, even if you're building the old brick buildings, right, in Ireland and England. So he's a hod carrier. And being an Irishman of those days, he liked to have a bit of a nip. And so the story is he's had maybe a bit of a too many nips when he's going up the ladder with his hod and he falls off. And he falls off so severely that every that everyone thinks he's dead. Now, in the old days, sometimes people would get very, very drunk. And there's an old term for it that we used to call dead drunk. He's dead drunk. And so the idea of a wake is where you lay him out and you make sure he's not going to wake up, maybe, that he's really dead before you bury him. And then, there's that whole idea. This you say, oh, now who could bury a live person? Why, you'd have to be daft, right? Well, if you've ever heard of a dead ringer, then you know that a dead ringer was, I guess they would move graves every so often and they'd find scratch marks on the inside of coffins. And so they started putting a string down in there so that a person could pull this string and it would ring a bell up on the top. And so then the graveyard watchman would know that, okay, we got the dead ringer out here. We got to dig him up. He's alive. And so that's when they look at a person and they say, oh my God, you look just like him. You're the dead ringer of that guy. Means like you look like you came from the grave. You're the same guy, right? so so they've got Finnegan, and he's all laid out at his wake, and they're all crying, and they're all, they're a bit rowdy at a wake, maybe. And so they get to drinking a bit, as might have happened in a wake or two and over the hundreds of years. And they get so rowdy that they spill the whiskey on Finnegan. And well, he imagined this. He wakes up, and when he wakes up, he's like, "Oh, you all thought I'm dead." Right now, if you want to get this story, there is a traditional song. Go on YouTube, search for Finnegan's Wake or for Finnegan, and you'll get the whole song that'll tell you the whole traditional version of the story. But so Joyce uses this as a great metaphor for the whole story that he tells. So Joyce is a master of language, and I believe there are 50 some languages, parts of which are all showing up inside of Finnegan's Wake.
And he invents a bunch of language
He
in
invents a
Finnegan's Wake,
lot of language, and some of it's just wonderful.
and some of it is 100 plus letter words that I
Ah,
couldn't even begin to pronounce.
Well, they're those you're referring to are the thunder words.
Oh, I thought they were just Icelandic, but go
No,
ahead.
no, no, exactly, or Welch.
Uh-huh.
But maybe it's in that spirit. What the thunder words are, there's 10 thunder words. And what the thunder words are supposed to do is they're supposed to wake us up. That's what thunder words are for. And each thunder word is a different, it's made up of parts of different words from many languages usually. And so one of the thunder words is the word for thunder in all these different languages. And one of the thunder words is set up and it's intended to be the sound of Finnegan hitting all the rungs of the ladders as he falls down. Okay. So Finnegan, he becomes the. Now, this is a thing with Joyce. Okay. Now, if you look at Ulysses, Ulysses is about a man and it's about his peregrinations, to use Rich's word, around the city of Dublin. And Dublin is also where Finnegan's Wake takes place. But Ulysses is considered the daytime novel. Finnegan's Wake is considered the nighttime novel. But it's called Ulysses, and it's about, if you know the story of Ulysses, also known as Odysseus, right? He was the one that took 10 years to come home from the Battle of Troy, and he met the Cyclops and he met the sirens where he had to be tied to the mast and he had all these adventures. Well, Ulysses, the novel, is about an ordinary man and he's got his own troubles that ordinary men have. And I won't go into them because I don't want to be a spoiler. But what Joyce does constantly is he shows the heroic in the everyday, in the mundane. So in this case, a hod carrier becomes the hero of the story and he becomes every man. And and the other character that becomes every man is what is it? HSC Humphrey HC Humphrey Chimden. Oh, how can I forget it? Earwigger, of course, Earwigger. HCE. Here comes everybody. Okay. So so now the longer story of HCE and his wife and his children, which are which have the brother controversy going back and reprising the story of Cain and Abel, and there's a whole thing there, right? And then a lot of this is in dialect that Joyce actually told people, if you read a section and you don't understand it, just read it aloud and listen to it. And so he plays a lot with putting together words that are new words that either sound like other words or they use pieces of other words. So this new word has the association of both of those words. So, for example, one of his great Joycean words is chaosmos. Now, if you know the Greek word cosmos, cosmos in Greek means order. So Joyce takes the word cosmos apart, and instead of cos, he puts chaos. So we have chaosmos, implying that the universe is actually this dance between chaos and order. The universe is the chaosmos. And he does, and he just does. I mean, that's just a little example. That's just a little fish out of a huge pond of so many wonderful things that Joyce does. And he pulls in allusions that, okay, here's a weird one. In the first few pages, he has the sound quack 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 quack. And you read this and you go, huh? But if you were a Greek scholar like some of us were, you would recognize that that came from The Frogs by Aristophanes. And so he's got these references that come from everywhere. And you know, as you read this, that most of these are going through your fingers, like sand through your fingers. But the ones that you get are so juicy that you're compelled, hopefully, to keep going. And once you get into it, they say if you make it past the first 25 pages or so, then you have a better chance. And it's true. my first 6 attempts, I didn't make it through the first 25 pages. But the skeleton key, and also, you know who else is a scholar about this? Is Terence McKenna. And he's given, you notice how all these guys, McLuhan and McKenna and McMahon, what's the same? Well, we're all mix, right? So there is something going on there. And within Irish culture, there's a position of what they call Shawnachie. And the Shawnachie is a storyteller, but storyteller doesn't really do uh, benefit to the term Shawnachie. I think it's got much more historical and cultural roots. It's more of an identity carrier and transmitter through all of these stories,
Hmm.
so it's revered like a judge would be revered, not just somebody who's,
Not just
tells
a
you
conduit.
stories. Yeah, exactly, a cultural conduit. And so Joyce does this amazing thing. The logic, or the book is written like with the logic of dreams, which is to say, it's very difficult to follow because dreams just jump from one image to another image, and they will take certain things as common, and then all of a sudden you're in a new place because of that common thing became a portal, so to speak. So, and this is where the skeleton key can tell you the things that are overlaid onto those stories. Like, for example, okay, we know Finnegan fell off of his ladder. Well, Humpty Dumpty, he also fell, and so Humpty Dumpty shows up, right? And he's got a role to play. And our character, so the basic story is our main character, Humphrey Chimden Earwicker. Uh, he's he's a character who was transplanted from Norway or somewhere in the. He was a Viking, right? And so Earwicker comes to represent. See, the Earwicker and his wife, who are, he owns a bar. Uh, but they, in this way that the common man in Ulysses becomes Ulysses, they become archetypal. So she comes to represent the Liffey, which is the river that runs through Dublin, and he comes to represent the hillside that comes out at a certain park as its head, as if he were a great mountain laying down on the land, and the relationship between the hillside and the river. So the first word of the book is river run. And when you finally read the whole book, you realize that the first sentence was only the last half of a sentence. And the last sentence in the book is the first half of that sentence. And that sentence is all about the course of the river Liffey and the relate. So there's just so much going on,
I've
but we
got that
still
first sentence here, and it starts with a
go ahead and
lowercase,
read it.
right?
Yes, go ahead and read it.
River run past Eve and Adams from
Past
swerve
Eve
of.
and Adams, right? Because Earwicker and his wife have now become are taken as archetypal man and archetypal woman. So past Adam and Eve's. Go ahead.
Okay, so river run past Eve and Adams from swerve of shore to bend of bay brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to
Okay, now
Howe
let me stop
Castle
you
and
there.
environs.
Let me stop you there. The commodious vicus. Okay. So there's Vicos. Jean Battista Vico was a historian who, like we have spoken about, these historians that have this idea of cycles. Well, that's what Jean Battista Vico was into, was these cycles. And the book is in four big parts that reprise the the chapters of the four stages of the cycle. That is the overlay for all human stories progress. Okay, so and there's more, because obviously commodius vicus is Latin, and so there's a whole thing going on there with that. But keep going. It's just wonderful. It's just wonderful.
So, yeah, so brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs.
Recirculation, right? Yeah. To Howth Castle and environs, which is the I believe Howth Castle is where the head of this big laying person that represents HCE finds lays his head, and so the issue, see, HCE, like Finnegan, he has to experience a fall, and his fall happens in a park that I believe is in the environs of Howth Castle, if I recall it right.
Which is also an HCE, Howth Castle and environs.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And then the last line is away, alone, alast, aloved, along, the.
River Run. Yes. Yeah. Phew. Yeah, I mean, what just yeah. So what is this all about the fall and the rise? And and this is Joyce's big message. And this is what I like about it. One of the things, one of the many, many, many things I like about it so much is so he talks about the rise, or we start, the old story, like, what's the story of the Roman Empire, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, right? And that's the normal thing that happens, the rise and the fall. And in fact, the model, jumping to Federico Fagin, the model that says that we build up from matter and consciousness is built out of a bunch of matter that's interacting very cleverly, is that idea of the rise, right? Uh, this model is different. This is the model of the phoenix. This is the model that gets taken on by Christianity in the crucifixion story. Finnegan falls and then he rises, right?
What does that inversion symbolize? The inversion of the rise and fall to the fall and rise.
Well, it involves that we came from spirit and we fell into matter and we rise again back into spirit, as opposed to we are just from ashes and return to ashes, which is quite a different model, isn't it?
Uh-huh. And the ashes to ashes, dust to dust, that's Old Testament too, isn't it?
It is Old Testament, but rising again
Is New
is New
Testament.
Testament.
Yeah.
And of course, there's Catholicism all over this book.
Yeah, gotta be.
Yes. Well, it's Irish.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's what we see. And that's the story that underlines it all. Is that yes, we're all going to fall. We have fallen off of our hod carrier because we've been drunk with in the world of matter. And but that with the waking up, okay, and this has to do with the times that Joyce wrote in, and the world was in a very turbulent place, and there was this sense of that things needed to be waking up, and that there was a waking up, and there was a lot of war, and so so there's 10 thunder words to wake us up, and there's also, if this idea seems fun to you, there are videos on every one of the 10 thunder words. Go on YouTube, search Thunderword number 1, Thunderword number
Yeah.
2, and he'll break it all down for you, and if you really wanna have impress your friends at parties, you can use those videos to learn how to say those thunder words, and you will have a skill that
I
nearly no one you know has.
Yeah. I was just trying one of them that might have been Finnegan falling down the ladder.
Okay.
Uh, but but you just brought up the time in which it was written, which is interesting. For some reason, I thought Joyce was writing in the late 1800s, but I just looked it up, and Finnegan's Wake was published in 1939. And it's interesting to say that's a time that the world was waking up or needed a waking up, because it's also the getting into one of the darkest periods in human history.
Exactly, exactly. And it was a time, I think, when globalization, maybe not maybe not what we mean by that now, but in those days, just the influence, the international of influence that was going on was new, maybe, or happening at a new level, and so there were interactions that were happening on a new level. Interestingly similar to today. Uh, like we were mentioning today that we have apparently listeners we know in Uganda, we have listeners maybe in Russia, we have listeners in the UK, and we have listeners here in America, of course, most of them. But this is a new thing, and in those days, I think there was a similar newness to the people of different nations interacting, and then of course they had just come out of World War One, and they, and a depression, which is all this sort of again the how do we work together? How do we, you know?
Uh-huh. It's interesting. My brother-in-law was just making an argument this past weekend about how the internationalization that you're just referring to has actually been a norm for much longer than we realize, and that as soon as transatlantic trade was a thing, that and travel within the um, Europe, Asia, Africa, it goes back a long way,
Yeah,
and so he was positing that it's a little bit arrogant to think that the international exchange is such a new thing, and that really we've had cross pollination for a very long time, and that it made me curious about that we take for granted that this is a recent phenomenon, and yeah, it just makes me curious about
yeah.
the context there.
Well, and I wonder if there's a class thing that is involved there. I mean, I think we know that there's been cross pollination amongst the upper classes because the Russian elites spoke French more than they spoke Russian, and wore French clothes and drank French champagne and all that. So I think there has been always, and I wonder whether it was a popularization because remember, Joyce was writing about HCE. Here comes everyone. His point was that every man is Finnegan. Every man who falls can rise again, and so it might be that what really happened was that there was enough education in the masses that they could reach beyond their own little worlds. Uh, I'd be interested in the impact of literacy, for example, on those uh, effects. But yeah, so amazing thing there with what Joyce did, and he he also like there's a whole dimension that I haven't spoken about, which is the way he plays with all of your training within the languages that build up sets of associations that he starts to play with by taking things apart and putting them back together in new ways so that he can mean new things, which is kind of an interesting capacity of language. And I read a book on linguistics called what was it called? Women, Fire, and Other Dangerous Things, maybe something like that. And
Okay.
and they were talking about the plasticity of language. It's like once you understand the system, you don't need to know all the words. And the example that they used that sticks in mind was he says, okay, you've got somebody, a guest staying over at a friend's house, and they come down to breakfast, and the hostess knows that the guest doesn't like apple juice, which is set for everybody. So they are set with orange juice. So when the guest comes down, the hostess says to the guest, you sit at the orange juice chair. Well, there's no concept in English that's been pre established orange juice chair. And there's a good chance that the person, the guest, has never heard the word orange juice and chair ever associated together in such a way. But because they share the same system that has the same parts and the same rules, they can instantly build an association out of those pieces that serves them in the moment. And that's kinda what Joyce does. He's just like it's like we let him into the Fools and Sages etymological workshop with a power saw or a chainsaw or something
Mhm.
and a welder, and he just went nuts. And and so you have all of these etymons, the word etymology comes from the Greek word etymon. And in the case of etymology, the etymon of etymology is etymon, right? So etymon, uh, it means true or actual. So etymology means true word or actual word, and the etymon is that root word that comes through, right? So Joyce takes these things apart and puts them back together in ways that you've never heard of,
Yeah.
or but that you'll know if you think about it or if you listen to it. He plays with you a lot, and so people listen to it or they pick up Joyce. They go, "Oh, this is ponderous. This is," but it's actually there's a lot of joking, and a lot of it is plays. I mean, it's plays on words, so it's really playful, but it's so impenetrable at first stab that people get serious about it, and it's like, well, don't let it scare you. Like, just like wade in a little bit, but also use these extra things. Anthony Burgess has some videos where he explains a lot of these things that I've talked. Uh, just this video will help you maybe get a handle on at least some things of what's going on. Okay, not all of them. The skeleton key you definitely need.
I was, just that made me think of a couple of books that I love, where wordplay is featured. Ridley Walker, obviously.
By Russell Hoban. Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful.
But that one is pretty accessible. I didn't get like the first few pages are a little bit of a there's an acclimation process, but it's not so obtuse that I couldn't get past that
Yeah,
relatively
yeah,
easily and really enjoy the book. And by the end, I felt like I could speak a new language to some extent.
right. Now, Mark Twain, of course, was the first one to do that, uh, to use dialogue in Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. But one that's really cool, that's a little bit of a diversion, but it's so cool I want to mention it. It was a little controversial, but it's too cool to let the controversy back you off. And it's by a lady named Ruth Beebe Hill, and it's called Hanta Yo. And Hanta Yo, what Ruth Beebe Hill did was very genius, I think. She took okay, when the Anglos came and, took the Lakota children and put them into Indian schools, what the Lakota did was they took, 12 children and they hid them, and they taught them the old Lakota language, and they taught them the old Lakota ways and to keep preservation. So Ruth Beebe Hill finds the last one of those kids who's an old man whose name was Chuksayuha. And she take so so she finds him and she writes this story. And it's a long story. And then with his help, she translates this whole story into Old Lakota. And then they translate it from Old Lakota back into English. And what happens is it's like Old Lakota, it's like the English language was filtered through the world view of Old Lakota. You know how we talked how that the world we live in is created, the semantic world, different than the physical world, that semantic world that's created by our language and our culture. Well, she basically took English, put it through the semantic world of Old Lakota, and then gave us the result. And when you read this book, it's long enough that when you read this book, you will language differently. You'll get and there's a beginning where it says a list of words that none of these words show up in this book because these words don't exist in the old language.
Yeah.
And when you learn to think in the terms of the old language, even though you're using English words to do it, some of that comes across. I'm not going to say it really does justice to if you were truly could speak old Lakota and you had that worldview, but it's enough to move you off of your place.
Yeah.
It's another angle to try to get the crowbar under that tack that's nailed your foot down in the
In that
house, in the
room.
room that you were
Yeah.
born in. Yeah. And so
Yeah.
in that case, and just on the topic of books, I gotta say, wow, this is another amazing thing that can be done with language that apparently only one person has so far thought to do, at least in the case of Old Lakota. So way
Well,
more than just
actually, I was just
translating,
thinking
really,
of,
but
I just finished, The Man in the High Castle, by Philip K. Dick,
another genius.
and that's in there, because in the Pacific occupied territory, the conquered people that have been conquered for about 15 years, you hear what they're thinking,
Mm,
right? And they're thinking in what sounds like how a Japanese translation of English would go, with many fewer articles, for example, no
interesting,
thes,
interesting.
no us, right? And so it absolutely gives a different flavor.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and I thought that when I read Ridley Walker, time back, way back, uh,
Before everything went Argo Arga.
exactly, before they released the Heart of the Sun and the Heart of the Stone. What a
Uh-huh.
genius work, what a and I believe that Hoban was influenced by Joyce. I can't not believe it. Who
Seems
else
like
was the Thomas Pynchon, also just like a seminal American novelist. He was clearly, and I believe it's acknowledged that he was influenced by Joyce. So a lot of people were, a lot of people were. Um, but yeah, there's just nothing quite like it. Nothing quite like it, and nothing quite like Hantayo either. So that's why I wanted to give a shout out to that. Now I did see, because, I read this kind of in a vacuum, and I guess I might have looked and seen that maybe there was some controversy around it. I don't remember exactly what it was. Uh, but if it had anything to do with, as I recall, it probably had something to do with racial insensitivity somehow. But honestly, I don't know. I feel like it gave a foundation for a respect to a different worldview that maybe is on the ball in a lot of ways that our new ways maybe have slipped, and that we need to have a respect for those traditions and the knowledge that's carried in those. That's why we don't want old languages to disappear. We definitely want to, do what we can to support those. But yeah, back to Finnegan's Wake, I mean, there's just nothing like it, and, yeah, there's just so much to it, and I don't wanna make it sound too hard, but I don't wanna make it sound too easy. There's a little bit of work involved there, but there's help. I do think that the skeleton key is a big help. Some of the videos about it, the same help, and the good thing about the videos is they can, as I have hopefully tried to do, they can kinda gesticulate towards some of the treasures that's really in there if you wanna pay the work to do the search.
I was just looking at other books published in 1939 just to see if I could get a flavor of, what the literary world was like then. And The Grapes of Wrath
Right,
was 1939. The Big Sleep, by Raymond Chandler.
right,
Johnny Got His Gun.
okay.
Finnegan's Wake, of course. There was another interesting one in here. Oh, The Wall by Sartre.
Oh, of course.
Tropic of Capricorn by Henry Miller.
Henry Miller, yeah,
So yeah, it's interesting because I've always thought of, Joyce as being 30 years before that or 40 years
mhm,
before that for some reason.
yeah.
But I guess a lot of these novels are kind of grappling with, meaning making, right? Grapes of Wrath kind of coming out of the depression into a what next, and then I haven't read The Wall by Sartre, but I can imagine, it's more in the existential direction of like, oh my God, has all meaning been lost?
Yeah, I don't remember Sartre, writing any light and airy kinda novels.
Yeah.
Yeah. You gotta wonder if he ever got invited to parties.
Metamorphosis, I mean, is sort of darkly humorous.
Uh-huh. Kafka?
Yeah. Oh, that's Kafka, not Sartre, right, of course.
Yep,
Yeah.
yeah. Also, another wonderful storyteller, though, Kafka, not irrelevant to today. You know, for people that don't know, there's a whole word that came from Kafka called Kafkaesque.
He didn't invent that one, I don't think, but certainly
I think
it
his
followed
parents
him.
did.
Yeah, and that's a good word for our times. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, you know, he wrote a couple books that I think gave that term its flavor, the trial, and the trial, you know, is actually it's genius. You know, a guy is, he's accused of something like is, uh, Humphrey Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, accused of something, and, uh, and basically he is put on trial and goes through the whole thing and convicted, and the whole time he never knows what it was that he was accused of doing. And the castle is the same sort of thing where the guy comes and the powers that be are up in the castle, and he just never ever sees or can the people that are calling the shots are always out of the touch. Always, you know, you have no direct interaction with them, like the judge in the trial. You can't. You're just powerless. And I think that leering hand of authoritarianism is something that's haunted human history for quite a while.
That one evokes, bureaucracy, also, like, just that even scarier than authoritarian, than, I guess, tyranny, not just authority, is the void created by unmanageable bureaucracy that, like, you could very easily get into the kind of gridlock where you just can't get anything done. And I actually experience that consistently if I'm trying to change my internet service or trying to pay my property taxes online or just
I
like,
used to work with the state of New Mexico, and you know where we end up is with the movie Brazil, where everything doesn't quite work,
yeah,
and you know, but it's always a bureaucracy. I loved when they take her husband and they give her an invoice. That's exactly what that's and that the whole thing went awry because a fly landed on the teletype and Buttle turned into Tuttle.
uh-huh,
That's it. I had somebody, a serious, and I mean an adult in an office, expect me to drive an hour to go put a hashtag in front of an address number. Like instead of 10 Main Street, they wanted hashtag 10 Main Street. They wanted me to drive an hour there and an hour back just to do that. I was like, you know what, bro? I'm not that stupid, and neither are you. Then he was able to work it out with his supervisor. It took a supervisor to
yeah,
say, okay, yeah, go ahead, put the hashtag in there. We're good. It's like, you know, when the Western world collapses, this is going to be a big part of why. You know, y'all are just fretting over hashtags here. Come on.
yeah,
You know, but the computer, it's like, yeah, the computer is a tool to make your job easier, not to give you whole other nonsense things to pay attention to. Like that's what it's happened. And they're really nice, well-intentioned, well-educated, friendly people, just doing the stupidest stuff. This is unbelievable. But I digress.
yeah. It's interesting. I have read Dubliners. When you mentioned it, I remembered. And it's totally accessible and even bland.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is also very accessible.
Uh-huh. I haven't read that one.
Yep,
So what do you think happened? I assume Dubliners predated. Oh yeah, you said Finnegan's Wake was his last work.
yep,
So
yep.
was this um, like the unfettered expression that he'd been holding back the whole time? Do you think, or
I think he wrote it over a lot of years.
okay,
And so, you know, it's kinda like the literary equivalent of "Look, Ma, no hands." On some level, he had mastered the this plasticity of language and image, and then message conveyed through that in a dreamlike way, because it's like he understood that dreams work, or that the collective unconscious works in these archetypal imagery, random association, but not entirely random, themes running through things, but that you feel half of them, you can't quite. That's why I said this is like a well-greased pig. You can't always grasp all of it, but you grasp enough of it to get stuff, you know? So it's very unique. It's hard to, I mean, to it I mean, it's appropriate that we're trying to explain Finnegan's Wake on Fools and Sages, because it's a fool's errand to try to explain it, because it's like, you know, try to empty the teacup, the ocean with a teacup, you know, you're gonna be at it. And so anyway, it's just about, I mean, it's a mystery wrapped inside a enigma. How does that go?
Yeah, something like that.
The Russian doll of mystery.
Yeah.
And but it pays out if you, when you piece it together. And there are reading clubs I know that read Finnegan's Wake together, and they just try to do a few pages at a time, and then maybe they each go off. And now the internet has made this infinitely more doable, so that you can do it and you have less of a chance to gang agly.
To
Have you
what?
ever heard that expression? To
No?
gang agly, to go wrong.
Uh-huh. It sounds like, it would come from Hobain.
Uh, well, and you know, the everything, and this is another thing that's been said about Finnegan's Wake, is that everything is in Finnegan's Wake. And I found things. I think I found my own name in Finnegan's Wake somewhere. Which, you know, it's like so. And I'm certainly not the first one with my name, so that's not a mystery, is it?
I wonder if I'd
But
find mine.
you know, it wouldn't be that surprising. You
Really.
know, yeah,
I wanna
yeah,
I wanna go back to there's a theme here about how language creates the semantic world, and how we're downloaded a certain program when we're first introduced to language, and then there's the kind of the plasticity of the brain at a young age going along with the ability to learn multiple languages and thereby have a different or broader semantic
broader, yeah.
reality.
Yeah, they say we can learn 4 if you're trained as a child.
And I mean, I know folks that in places like one of the companies I used to work with was in Luxembourg, and they were trading with France and Belgium and the Netherlands, and I think even into Italy and Spain, and so I would visit their office, and they would literally be switching languages from one phone call to the next, and sometimes within a phone call between all of those different languages, and they were very facile about it, but more than 4. I mean, 6, 7
Hey, we do
easy.
that in New Mexico all the time, Keno.
Or that's 2 languages at once sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but where I was going was, kind of the the semantic world being created through language, and I think to a large extent in the United States we we don't experience multiple languages at an early age, but we do experience other things that maybe stand in for language. For example, well, I mean, there's like other academic areas, say like math or music, that require similar plasticity. But then there's also how we access so much more information via the internet compared to prior. And I guess I'm curious what you think about whether our semantic worlds are narrower as a result of less exposure to a variety of languages, or if that's offset somehow by, kind of what you referred to as globalization earlier, or internationalization.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I my suspicion is that there's probably trends in both directions, that we're gonna trend towards what they used to call a lingua franca back when everybody spoke French if you were elite and educated. When I was referring to the Russians speaking French, those were the times that made French the lingua franca, which means a language that everybody sort of speaks commonly. to be able to communicate. Down in South America, among the natives, the language is Quechua, and they might speak Jivaro, they might speak Shipibo, they might speak whatever their native language is, but usually the men will often speak Quechua, and that enables them to trade with other tribes and things like that. And so that's it's kind of a thing that has happened, uh, with the way culture sort of works, where cultures have to interact within themselves, but then they also have to interact with cultures outside. And I think Latin, before French, Latin was one of those, which is why we see its influence in Italian and Portuguese and French and some degree in English, some degree in, of course, in Spanish. Did I miss anybody?
Romanian, interestingly.
Romanian,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and, so we see this kinda cross-pollination. English, of course, is a language that engulfs and devours other languages, which is why we have to have such a big etymology shop because there's just so many parts, right? So, so no, there's an interesting thing that happens there, and how that changes our perceptual world is subtle. Uh I got there was a point where I was, pretty fluent in Spanish. And so I was having dreams and I was talking to people in Spanish regularly. And I did kind of perceive the world a little differently, and or more it's like the me that met the world was mapping things a little differently because it was a different semantic plug-in to my already existing semantic world, and it came to feel like Spanish was just another way to speak English because of those common roots. So and this is where learning Latin really helps. So for example, in English, we have the word fire, but fire is an Anglo-Saxon root word, and we have the word flame, which I believe comes from French. But we also have a kind of an older word in English that a lot of people might not know, and the word is conflagration. And if you know that older Latin word, and you know one little rule of how things change, you can jump across to Spanish, and you have the word conflagracion, which is fire. They also typically, though, will use the word fuego, right? But so languages do that. They kind of erect or set with each other, and sometimes it's over specific fields. But it's interesting because there's all sorts of observations that get kind of coded into those language. You know, so for example, in Spanish, try to not get in trouble, your wife is esposa, right? Well, if you make it plural, esposas is handcuffs. Right.
Oh, recently I was wondering about the word embarazada, right, which means pregnant in Spanish and is so similar to embarrassed in English, and I wondered
Right.
which came first.
Well, it's not related to embarrassed at all, it turns out. It comes from what it means literally is embraced. And so that's how you got pregnant, basically, is
Basically.
because the "ado" is the past, right? It's corresponds to "ed" in English. So, in embraced, the "ed" turns into "ado," and embrazado, we're just pronouncing it in Spanish.
That's interesting because I'm looking up the etymology of embarrass in English, and one source, I guess it's Oxford, says it's from French embarasser, from Spanish embarazar, probably from Portuguese embarazar. Halter, apparently originally with reference to animals being restrained by a cord or leash, which kind of goes to embrace. Um,
Oh, that's interesting. So they diverge there
yeah,
somewhere.
yeah, there's a
Yeah.
tree. And yeah, another source says the Portuguese embaraçar, the base word means noose plus the prefix em, right, or in.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Like lassoed almost.
Yeah, that's how you get pregnant.
Like we would bar something. Well, when you're embraced, you're barred from leaving, I guess, or your
Could be.
movement is barred. So maybe that's the bar root in there.
Yeah.
You know.
And then the I don't see the connection from a noose or being restrained. Maybe that's it, just restraint when we're embarrassed, we restrain ourselves or something.
Yeah, maybe that's it. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. And, yeah, or maybe that was a meaning, yeah, that got derived later in the English somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
I
it's
do.
curious that way because it's not always exactly what you might think that it would be.
Yeah.
And there's some funny ones like that. Constipado is another Spanish one. And, constipado in Spanish, I mean, it's literally, it comes from the idea of something being obstructed. And when con is a tip off that it comes from Latin. But they're talking about the nose being stuffed up in Spanish with
I
constipado.
imagine stipado and stipulate, would be, common somehow.
Yeah, I bet you they do. That's stipulare would probably be the Latin root.
Yeah.
To restrict, as in to specify, something like that.
Cool. Fun with etymologies.
Yeah, it is fun, and now, with AI, any word that you don't know, you just type in "etymology of" and then put that word in there, and it's like having your own etymology shop right in your phone. It'll just disassemble the words for you, and then once you have the pieces, you could even use those pieces to make new stuff.
Yeah.
Just saying,
Although
just saying.
it's harder to make new stuff than one might think. There being millions of words already,
Uh-huh.
um, made, yeah.
Well, you have to be creative, Like when we had kids, when the kids were little and they needed a nose wipe, they would ask for a blow noser, and so you can be fun with those things too.
That could be in Ridley Walker too. Maybe in
It could,
Finnegan's Wake, I don't know. But I'll give it
yeah,
another try. Right after I do the power steering pump, I'm gonna take a run at Finnegan's Wake.
it's fun. It's fun, and don't take it all at once. Take it at your time. Uh, it's a cycle, right? So like everything, and but also it's fun to search online stuff because it's like there's other folks out there that have been banging their heads on this too, and when you kind of share conclusions, it's kind of fun when you find one that that you think, wow, I bet most people don't know that, like brek coack coack, which is the sound of the frogs, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I recommend it. I know everybody nowadays has so much time on their hands, uh, but it is kind of a fun thing, and it's a flavor from so many places, and you can learn thunder words, you know. So there's all sorts of uniquenesses to it,
Yeah.
and
Cool.
tell them fools and sages say, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for the download, Brian. Yeah, interesting. Look forward to checking it out and to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, yeah, we'll do it.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good day, everybody.